Well, hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne, welcoming you to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me in the very crowded world of orchid YouTube videos. If you're new here and are interested, I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any heating or green lights or humidifiers or greenhouses, just me and them struggling either inside or outside, or we don't bother at all. So plant lovers of the world, if that sounds like your conditions and you're interested in following my very amateur journey, do hit subscribe. I post every Friday. And talking of amateur adventures, Exhibit A, ta-da, plant lovers. Today we are going to talk about Cattleyas in a cold climate, which is not the lost novel of Nancy Mitford. No, it is how have I tried and finally succeeded in growing Cattleyas in essentially a cold climate. Now, we have to give some caveats here. Of course, cold is relative. I'm in Melbourne in southern Australia. Now, our winters don't freeze. They can get pretty close, sort of 5-ish degrees centigrade, so the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. So that's the context of my cold climate. Of course, summers can be hot. They can also be variable, because right now it's mid-November, which should be very late spring in Australia, and it's still pretty chilly here in Melbourne, let me say. So when I first began growing orchids, it was very amateurish and with absolutely no knowledge whatsoever. And of course, Cattleyas are everywhere. And in Australia, we have a wide variety of climatic conditions, and there are a lot of Cattleya grows in the north of the east coast of Australia, which is subtropical and tropical. So in Queensland, particularly in Brisbane, lots of Cattleya nurseries and people hybridizing and amazing things going on there because, of course, it's the most perfect climate, not dissimilar to parts of Florida. However, I'm in Melbourne, so much further south, and as I said, our winters can be quite cold. So, not really knowing what I was doing, I started to buy seedlings in the early days of my career, and most of those have come to naught. However, I would still see Cattleyas at local shows and from local growers and think, well, people in Melbourne are growing Cattleyas. So what I have discovered, plant lovers, which I'm sure might be common knowledge to many of you, is that it's tricky. So I will give you an idea of my conditions, and I will link my grow space video to give you an idea. So basically outside, I have a growing area which is undercover, and it's covered in polycarbonate, transparent sort of plastic sheeting. So bright indirect light, protected from the rain, but not protected from the cold winter nighttime minimums. So it's not a greenhouse. It's more like a clear roof veranda, let's say. And because I don't really have the room inside, these plants have to survive outside. Now, of course, it's relatively easy to grow Cattleyas inside because your winters are going to be as warm as you like them. And the wonderful Rachel from Gardening and Duenza has, in fact, she published a book about growing Cattleyas on windowsills in Ireland. So that can be done. However, I don't have the room or the space, so mine had to survive outside in those conditions. So undercover, dry, bright indirect light, warm summers, but cool, cold winters. Let me just say, plant lovers, it's been a journey. And I don't think that journey is even remotely coming near its conclusion. I think if anything, we've actually just begun. So what I have figured out is a few basic things to try and grow Cattleyas in a cold climate, as Nancy Mitford would have said. So why don't I go through with you some of the things I have painfully learned over the last 3 years and see how I'm going to go in the future, because I feel I have made some positive advancements. Okay, so let's define our terms once again. I'm just going to talk about Cattleyas. Now, Laelias, which are related and quite similar and have been interbred with Cattleyas, I can grow quite well here. So some of those species can really take cool temperatures. As long as the light is bright and they're kept dryish in winter, they thrive. So they have thrived for me here in Melbourne and have bloomed. And in fact, I think I've made a video about them, which I will link. So this is purely about Cattleyas. So why don't we begin? I'll tell you what we will begin with is a book from the late 80s about growing orchids in Australia. And here it is, ta-da! It is called Exotic Orchids in Australia. Now, exotic in this context means not native orchids, because obviously Australia has a lot of native orchids. Now, Cattleyas, though, are native to Central and South America only, not Australia or Asia. And actually, they were named after quite an interesting chap, William Cattley, who was an English merchant and a sort of an amateur botanist who would have plants sent to him from all over the world. And his business was largely actually trading with Russia, strangely enough, but he collected a lot of plants from South America from various contacts. And he was one of the sort of first successful growers of what became known as Cattleyas in Britain, and the whole genus was named after him, which is quite an achievement. So his years were 1788, 1835, so Georgian really, in late Georgian, and that is when Cattleyas were being imported and discovered in the wild into Europe, and these amazing blooms were the most exotic things and quite fashionable at the time, and the beginning of generations of hybridization. Now, Mr. Cattley also worked with John Lindley, who that name you'll also be familiar with because he again was a British botanist who drew and collected and had things named after him, Lindleyana and Lindleyanum and Lindleyi. You'll see his name cropping up in a lot of plants around the world. Anyway, so that's the origin of the name Cattleya. So let's see what exotic orchids in Australia has to say. And doesn't that look very 80s? That kind of soft green and the pink. Anyway, it was written by a man called David L. Jones and it was published in 1990. Now it's interesting because firstly, I don't know about you plant lovers, but there aren't that many books about orchid growing. Odd, really, given that Orchidaceae is one of the biggest, I think, groups of flowering plants in the world. There are also very specialist books, but not many kind of really current generalist books, I have to say. Anyway, there's a gap in the market. Here's a few words of wisdom, and I got this in a secondhand bookshop, and it was the princely sum of $24, Australian dollars. So let's just see. So Mr. Jones says, Cattleyas, they grow on trees or rocks, often in very exposed situations, and range from lowlands to above 2,500 meters in altitude. In parts of their range, the climate is strongly seasonal, wet and dry seasons. This seasonality is reflected in the distinct dormant and active growth stages of many species. Members of this genus are generally regarded as being easy to grow. However, a few species also have the reputation of being difficult, with the frequent result being of a slow decline in health and vigor. Growers commonly recommend about 15 degrees centigrade as a minimum temperature for species of Cattleya. However, some of those from higher altitudes will tolerate lower temperatures. So, interesting. So this is where it gets tricky, doesn't it? Because what I have got to try and figure out is what are those cooler, higher altitude growing Cattleyas. Now, the species are kind of easy because you can find the species and find where it liked to grow and try and replicate that. But most Cattleyas that you find in the market now are hybrids, and in fact some of them are incredibly complex with mad names. Brassolaeliocattleya and Potinara, which is a mix of I think 4 different types of Cattleya type of orchids, etc, etc, etc. So it is quite a journey trying to figure out which ones can grow for you. But I'm getting there. So I'm going to share what I found to date. Now this is really a work in progress because as you can see, here's one flower and one other flower. Not a great result. And you'll see amazing Cattleyas on YouTube orchid growers videos. So this is very niche. This is growing Cattleyas in a cold climate. So bear with me. So the first thing then is find yourself a cool growing Cattleya. Now that's easier said than done. There are certain species that are high altitude growers and you can have a look at those. And I'll put some in the list below. One of the most famous being Cattleya maxima, and there is a highland and a lowland version of that. But the other thing is that a lot of Cattleya species have a vast array of natural habitats, some of which is basically at sea level, in fact, sometimes quite close to the sea, and then others can grow in higher altitudes and quite cooler. So even within a species, you can get a huge variety of preferred habitat, which does make it a little bit confusing. Anyway, a good source of information is orchidspecies.com, which I'll put below, and you can type in the name of your species orchid and see what its preferred habitat is. Now, if you've got a hybrid, you probably want to go to orchidroots.com, which will show you what the ancestors, the species ancestors are of that plant, and that can maybe again help you figure out if you've got a cool, warm, intermediate growing orchid. But I think the easiest thing to do is to find local growers and also to see what is available in your local market. So let's start with that. A good place to go is join your local orchid club. And I know I always say that, and it's a tedious thing, but it really is the best way to figure out what other people are growing around your area and what might thrive and what their conditions are. Now, of course, people in local orchid groups might have greenhouses and lots of heat and different conditions to you, but there'll always be someone probably growing in the same way as you. And I have found a lot of what's called in Australia cold growing, which means you're growing it outside without any heating in southern Australia. Obviously, the further north you get, you certainly don't need heating because it's subtropical and tropical. But in the southern states, we call growing orchids outside under cover with no heating cold growing. And I have been lucky enough to find many cold growers who tell me the tips and tricks of their trade, but also you can see the plants that are thriving from them and try and get yourself one. And often by joining a club, you will also get access to their sales, which will often include divisions of plants which people are growing in similar conditions to you. So that really is, I think, number one, tickety-boo, 106%, best way to know what Cattleyas might grow in your cool climate. Case in point then being this one. Now I know this looks rather scabby and that flower is really going over, but this is one of those mad hybrids. And this is, it's actually a cross between a Brassolaeliocattleya and Potinara, which again is a mega hybrid, it's an intergeneric mix of many, many species. But what I have found, a common thread and common theme in Melbourne, is that the more compact, orangey scarlet, hybridized and quite complex hybrid Cattleya types do very well in cool, cold growing conditions here in Melbourne. Often one of the common ancestors of this type of quite complex hybrid is Cattleya Claesiana, also known as Sophronites cochineae. They're quite small, quite scarlet growing, and that's actually quite a cool grower. So there you go. First thing that I have figured out from other growers is that the more compact, orangey scarlet flowers do quite well. So I was very lucky in that last weekend I went to a rare plant fair, which I didn't expect there to be any orchids, and there was an orchid grower that I bought many things from online, who I've never seen at a plant or an orchid fair, had a stand. You can imagine my heart went pitter-pat. Anyway, all I could see was cymbidiums at the front. I thought, oh, there you go. I don't need more cymbidiums in my life. I really don't. And I was prepared to skip on past, but what I did see at the back were other things. And there were some blooming Cattleyas. So we'll have a look at this one. And we're looking at this one. There were some other things too. There were some Coleogenes and some other orchids anyway. But it was the Cattleyas that intrigued me because this guy, and it's a company called Orchids on Newbold, and I'll link that below, grows inland and in an area that gets even colder winter nighttime minimums than me. And he grows his in an unheated condition. So basically the same as mine, but with colder winter nighttime minimums. So directly from the horse's mouth, as it were, the grower's mouth, let's just say. So all of the things that he had growing conditions like mine. Now this one is very, very pretty. So I am very excited that this I should be able to do reasonably well with. Now the other thing, of course, as you can see, this is a mature plant. I'm a little bit over Cattleya seedlings. The thing is, you just know what you're getting, and it's already flowering size. It's got a fantastic, in fact, it's got two new growths here at the back. We'll get to the life cycle in a minute. So the other thing is, yeah, if you've got lots of patience, seedlings are great because you can experiment, but seedlings often take more specific care than perhaps their adult compatriots. So I don't know, I am not going down the cool climate Cattleya seedling route anymore. I'm a bit sick of it. I'm sticking to the grown-ups. Anyway, this one, I didn't think I told you the name, but it's Brassolaeliocattleya Angel's Pride, and it's crossed with Potinara Hawaiian Chio, I think, Orange Glow. Goodness me, there's some complex ancestry. We'll look forward to seeing what happens with this. Potted in plastic, it's wired up and staked up within an inch of its life, which I know is what people do with Cattleyas, but it's not my thing. Anyway, but we'll get to repotting in a minute. So that's my first discovery, is that type of orchid, generally, this type of Cattleya does quite well in a cooler climate. Okay, now the other orchid that I found from that same seller at the weekend is this one. Look at that. Very pretty. Now, again, the flower is just about to go over, unfortunately, but you get a sense of it. And the colours have faded somewhat, but it is a sort of a pale lilac with a much stronger lip. Very beautiful, isn't it gorgeous? And I think any fragrance it may have had has gone because the flower's a little old. Now, this one is Cattleya intermedia, and it's a cross between varieties of Orlata and Dennis. So this is a species orchid, well, a variety of a species orchid. So Cattleya intermedia has a vast range of habitat along the east coast of South America, so including parts of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, sort of all around there. But actually, heading quite south. So although it can grow at relatively low levels, i.e. sort of sea level, it can take more temperate, cooler temperatures in some parts of its range. So Cattleya intermedia and all of the varieties thereof is a great one to have a go at because that does like these cooler temperatures. Now this one is a division, as you can see, and it was growing in the same conditions that I have, basically, even cooler in winter though. So there we are. I am very happy with that. Now, of course, not a huge amount of difference in flowers, but never mind. So it seems that a lot of the cooler growing intermediate ones are versions of the same sort of lilac mauve. But anyway, we'll try and find some hybrids of all of these that have more color. But this is quite a good plant. We will get to growing cycles in a minute because I'm just looking at the new growth emerging there, but we'll get to that. Anyway, Cattleya intermedia is another one that has been proven to do well in these conditions. Now this brings us in a lovely narrative arc to this baby here. Now let's have a look at this. It's actually in a terracotta pot, but I just put it in a basket because I was just sick of it, but we'll get to that. So this is a vigorous plant, as you can see, and it's called Cattleya Claesiana flamea. Now, what this is a primary hybrid, which means it's a cross between two species. And the species are Cattleya intermedia, which we have just discovered is a cold climate, well, a cool growing, cool tolerant Cattleya, and another one, Cattleya legisii. Now, there's a name that we all know too. I've got Dendrobium legisii, for example. That was, again, another 19th century horticulturalist in Britain whose name was given to quite a few plants. So this one, both ancestors can take cool temperatures. Now, I didn't know that at the time. I bought this as a little seedling in one of those plastic tubes. Now, viewers in Australia will know what I'm talking about. From Bunnings, the little plastic tube with the little orchids, and they're sort of $8.95 usually. So that is the equivalent of a big box hardware store, so like B&Q in Britain or Home Depot in the States. And surprisingly enough, there's often some interesting orchids. In fact, the Dendrobium legisii I just mentioned, I got in one of those little plastic tubes, which is quite a find. I've never seen that orchid for sale ever in Australia before. Well, I haven't looked, but I haven't actually seen that orchid much before, so it was a miracle that it was in one of those tubes. That's an orchid that's doing well, let's just say. Anyway, so accidentally I bought this, not knowing what it was. Now, I also knew nothing about Cattleyas. This was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I have to say. And I'll come in and show you, but there are 2 leaves at the bottom of the plant, which I think were actually the original plantlet in the tube. Now, I then was living in an apartment in the city and it got bright indirect light, but I basically kept it indoors and it wasn't getting enough light to ever bloom, but it just grew and grew and grew. And it grew continually throughout the year. So it didn't have a sort of a particular growing season. It would grow sporadically whenever it felt like it, really. So I watered it and fed it occasionally, and the plant became this gangbuster beast, as you can see here, but never a hint of a flower. And then I knocked it off and snapped great bits of it. And then one year I must have got it a little too damp and one of the canes rotted. So I just cut it off and dabbed the cut with a bit of cinnamon and left it to it, and it sprouted and grew again. It's had scale. It's had all manner of things having a go at it. Insects have laid eggs in there, nibbling insects, which then, like little caterpillary buggy things, which ate the new growth. I mean, whatever could have happened to this orchid happened. But it was so vigorous, and I ended up just getting so sick of it, and I was bringing it in, taking it out. So last autumn, I decided, you know what, orchid, this is it. I am sick of you. I'm just going to plonk you in this basket, and I'm going to hang you up outside in a bright indirect space, But basically, you're going to have to deal with the winter. And if you survive, you survive. And if you don't, you don't. And I actually don't care anymore. And ta-da, there you go. Now, I did have a cane with a sheath last year when I was doing a collaboration with Rachel at Gardening in Winter. And I said, Rachel, you won't believe it, finally. And then guess what? Yes, I got it wet and wet in cold, and the whole cane rotted and died. I cut it off so it didn't affect the rest of the plant, but so there you go. Anyway, this year, here we are. Now, it is late spring and the flower is just a bit on the turn. But anyway, it is a beauty and I'm really happy about it. So accidentally, what I have got myself is a primary hybrid between two cool growers. So that's a lucky happenstance, really. You can see the flower is quite beautiful. It is a stronger mauve and lilac than its intermedia friend just over here. And there's more sort of figuration to the petals and sepals and the lip there. Quite beautiful and very, 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 very faint fragrance. And it's not particularly warm or sunny today, so it might be a little sweeter should the sun ever come out. Let's just talk about care then. So essentially, these are growing out all year outside. The essence is that in the warmer parts of the year, I'm watering them frequently. And in winter, I am really dialing it down. And I'm trying to only water them when it is sunny and warmer in the morning so the plant gets a chance to dry out. And I am trying to be scrupulous to not get any moisture in the leaf axis on the canes here, because what I have discovered is that though these orchids are cool, cold, tolerant, they are not tolerant remotely of being slightly damp and cold, because that does very, very quickly prompt rot. And that's happened to me a lot. And that happened with my beautiful Cattleyas maxima, which I'll link above, which was a great division. And I had the Highland version. So that's the cooler, colder tolerant plant. And again, I was just too liberal with watering and the cane rotted because it was quite a small division. There's only about 3 growth points. There wasn't enough bulk in the plant to kind of survive chopping it off, and the rot went straight through and dead it was. Devastated because that was a beautiful flower and I've never seen it for sale again as a division, only as seedlings, and I'm over seedlings. So first rule of thumb then I have learned is you can certainly water them, not as often in winter, but just be super careful that you don't get any moisture near the growing points because it will not like it. And then fertilizing, pretty similar too. So fertilize in those warmer periods when you are watering heavily, and I try and fertilize maybe every 3 waterings and then lay off completely in winter. And in spring, with all of my orchids, I give a topical application of a slow release fertilizer. Now, when it's summer and warm outside, I am much more liberal with the watering and I spray the whole thing because it will all evaporate and be completely dry within minutes. Sometimes it can be so hot and windy. But in winter, yeah, I'm just being much more careful now. So growth cycle wise, what I have found is that this one, this hybrid here, this primary hybrid, does tend to grow randomly. So it can put up new growth in winter, which is a bit tricky because you kind of need to grow and fertilize when something is putting up new growth. But I just really play it by ear and treat it a little mean in winter and don't water it and don't fertilize it. I can sometimes use a tonic in winter, like a seaweed-based solution or worm juice, really, really die down. Again, if it's warm-ish comparatively, and the plant will dry out in time. But so this can grow randomly. Now, the species ones I've noticed have a much clearer defined growth process. But anyway, let's look at this one. So I'll come in and show you. I've got a couple of new growth points coming out from the base of previous growths. And now, because this is such a tangled plant, there are multiple growth points, which is great. So ideally, those new growths mature, and it is that matured cane that will produce your flower for you. Now, these are sort of bifoliate, i.e. 2-leafed orchids, but of course this one has 3. So it just goes to show, don't get hung up on the number of leaves. You know, the plant can decide to throw out 3 leaves instead of 2. There are another group of Cattleyas that only have one leaf and much sort of chunkier pseudobulbs. So this one is very vigorous and it's producing shoots, new growths all the time. And the aim is that those new growths actually flower. But I have a new growth that just matured here, and there is no hint of a sheath in there yet. But you never know, at this time next year, it might sheath up as this one did. So in terms of repotting, and as I've just sort of ignored this orchid for quite some time, and it's in a terracotta pot, what I am going to do, later in the season when the flower is done and when these growths are a little bigger is I'm going to soak the whole thing overnight to soften those roots, get it out of this terracotta pot, and then I'm just going to pot it in this basket. I'm going to line it with some coconut fiber, and I'm going to use just a chunky bark in there and just let this ramble over this basket and live its best life outside. And I think one of my failings has been repotting them at the wrong time. Now, when you receive an orchid, like this one, for example, Cattleya intermedia, now you know my lack of love for plastic pots. I just find terracotta more attractive and it's a bit more sustainable, though, is it? Anyway, black plastic is not recyclable, FYI. So the temptation is, of course, to get it and immediately repot it once the flower's gone, but that isn't perhaps the best thing to do. Now, with this orchid, we can see on that hybrid that the growth points are quite established, and on the Cattleya / Sophronites coccinea, well, the hybrid of that, you can see that the growths there are really quite established already. But on this one, the species one, you can see, and I'll come in and show you. So this is last year's growth, or the latest growth that has flowered. And at the very bottom of it, just at the joint there, and I'll show you closely, you can just see it's just beginning to bulge and send out its new growth. So these species ones have a much more sort of linear growth in terms of the new growth produces a flower, then that produces one, produces one, produces one. The aim, of course, is to get multiple growth points because then you can get multiple flowering canes in each season. So that one is just beginning to show its nib of a new growth. And the skinneri over here is even further down the path, and it's just beginning to bulge at that joint there, just to show us the new growth coming through. So if I were to repot any of these, particularly these species ones, what I would wait is for this growth, which is just emerging at the bottom here, to be relatively tall and to start sending out some really vigorous roots. And the new roots you'll see are much more silvery with a very bright green tip. So they're active and they're searching for nutrients and great places to nestle into. So that's the time to repot. So I think what I've done in the past is receive things, so particularly seedlings, even quite established seedlings, and repotted them immediately when they're actually in a dormant or a sort of a stasis phase, so particularly in cooler weather. So don't do that if you're trying to grow them in my conditions. Now this one, the one that's the mega complex hybrid that's got, though, that sort of Sophronites / Cattleya Claesiana ancestry. Now you can see here, we've got this growth, which is, goodness me, that's about what, 4 inches? It's about 8-ish centimeters. That's already quite big. And you can see perhaps in there some green tipped root points. I'm still going to wait a bit for this. I'm going to wait for that flower to completely go over, and I'm going to wait for the weather to warm up before I repot this one. But the size of that growth, if it had a bit more vigorous root system, that would kind of be, I think, the time for me in my climate and my conditions to repot. And then in terms of repotting, Cattleyas essentially quite vigorous roots, and they are quite happy in my conditions. Obviously, this depends on wherever you're growing, but they're quite happy in just sort of medium to large bark pieces. Now, I do like growing in terracotta pots, and they do look really great in orchid pots with piercings around the edge. And I've made my own how to drill your own orchid pots. And when I was in Brazil quite a few years ago for a friend's wedding, I went to the Rio Botanic Gardens, and in their orchid house there were all of these terracotta pots with the holes around them and Cattleyas, and it was so beautiful. And I think that is seared into my mind about my aesthetic ideal for growing orchids. However, they do grow really well in baskets as well, and I think some people also have luck mounting, but I will be growing mine either in a basket or in terracotta pots. So that will be my preference, and just large bark. So there we are, plant lovers. It is a journey, isn't it? It is a progress. Anyway, so the Laelias are fine for me. It's the Cattleyas that have been the struggle. So this is spring 2023. Let's see how I go in spring 2024. Let's see how this one goes under its new regime outside. Let's see how this intermedia has gone under my conditions and a repot next year. Skinneri, let's see if that flowers for me again next year, and let's see if this complex hybrid, but a more compact plant with a lot of that coccinea ancestry. Let's see if that repot does well and that flowers for me next year. I'll be very curious to see. So this is definitely a work in progress video. They're a group of orchids that I've really just struggled with trying to get my head around in my conditions. So if you're growing yours in similar conditions, love to know your tips and tricks and which particular ones have done well for you. A few people have recommended things before, so thank you very much for that. It's always great to hear the exact type of plant that someone is growing in your conditions and it's thriving, because it does just help eliminate all this endless research and worry and perhaps waste of money buying the wrong plant that you kill immediately. So there we are, plant lovers. If you're interested in love in a cold climate or even Cattleyas in a cold climate, let us join forces again in a year's time and see how all these have gone. This I'm really happy with. This plant has been the bane of my existence for 5 years and I'm glad it's finally bloomed. Although there was actually 2 buds on the spike and 1 failed. So not quite sure what happened there. Anyway, it just didn't have the will to live. Perhaps now that it's bloomed once, it understands what it should do and it's learnt how to flower. Maybe next year we'll have a better result. But anyway, in the meantime, plant lovers, thank you very much for watching this ramble. I'm sure all of you grow Cattleyas brilliantly in your better climates and more expertise than me, but I'm excited that I think I'm getting a handle of how to grow them in my cooler conditions. So join me in a year's time if you want to see how I progress. But if you want to see what I'm doing next week, hit subscribe. I post every Friday. My amateur ramblings will be just that. Who knows what it will be, but I look forward to seeing you next week. And I hope wherever you are, things are well and dandy in your orchid world. Thanks for watching and see you next week.